did you like have a conversation to kind of work through understanding them being repentant and then have them tell their sibling that they're sorry?
Yeah, I mean, it would vary depending on the circumstances. They would still have to say they're sorry. I mean, a lot of times they knew that it didn't take a lot of talking about the effect that they had on the other person. And so, but we tried to thread this needle between demanding an apology versus having the apology be motivated out of the kid's concern for the other person and what impact they had on the other person, which is really the heart piece of it. So with younger kids, we're really trying to put in place something that we're later going to fill out in terms of understanding what motivates me to say that I'm sorry. And young kids, they don't get that at all because it's way too abstract for them. But I think with older kids, you can start the process young and then fill it in later as their cognitive abilities come along for the ride, kind of thing. So it could still sound very similar to what Clarissa said. You need to say you're sorry. But then there's got to be a conversation at some point about why do we say that at all, and how does that, what's the motivation for it relative to the other person. So any other questions on any of the other material or anything? Yeah.
So what if, like, in an adult relationship, like, the offender doesn't feel that there's anything wrong they've done,
Mm-hmm.
so they just don't feel repentant?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the point where you kind of just give it to God and forgo all the other phases?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is where the forgiveness comes in if you're the person that's been offended. And I think what we were talking about and what I was trying to communicate was that same idea is what the offender does or doesn't do is not in my power to do anything about. What is in my power to do is to forgive them and to release myself from them. So it doesn't, I think we end up having to really fight our sense of justice being violated by that whole thing. But the reality is forgiveness is built on grace. It is. And so I'm offering something to someone that doesn't even know they have anything to repay, which is really exactly what I'm like, really. So I think that's part of the kind of interplay between those two things is that, yes, in a sense, I'm cutting them loose. I am cutting them loose. And that's why I put on one of the slides, it's like an invitation. If they want to consider the impact of their actions on me, that's an invitation for them to do so, because I'm not tied to them anymore. Because most of the time we chain ourselves to the other person so we can extract what we believe we deserve. And that's usually where the problem comes in. And that keeps us stuck with the chains and stuff. Yeah, that's promising. Thank you very much. Okay. Any other questions or anything? I don't want to stop that too soon. Anybody has any other questions? Oh, you don't want that, right? You've heard that enough. Okay, well, what I want to land on is the last two dimensions that we've been talking about with just pure glass people and what they look like, and then I'll leave you with a thought. I don't know what it would be called. And then on Wednesday, there are no groups. We're back together again for one last time, just to talk through what you've learned, what you thought, how you thought about it, what's happening with it, all of that. So So let me pray, and then we'll get into the next two. Father, guide our time today. The last time to really look deeply into the characteristics of the people that want to be known, that want to know one another, that are willing to walk into the truth with one another, willing to choose forgiveness over justice, and give us the opportunity to look within these last two things, kind of the culminating aspects of what areas in our lives we need to cultivate, and what areas of our lives that perhaps we've left to grow fallow because it's just too hard. So give us the courage to look and the willingness to change and to try new things. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we did forgiveness last time. It seems logical to me that the next thing we need to talk about is conflict. And you probably have heard the phrase, losing or winning the peace and losing the war. I want to rephrase it to winning the peace and losing the opportunity. And the opportunity really for intimacy. Most people don't think of conflict that way. We think of conflict as destructive, as character assassinating, as things that will blow up a relationship. And we miss really the key elements to it that I think are pretty important to keep in mind when we're talking about conflict. We have all of those stereotypes in our head for a reason, mostly either from the fears we have about what happens in a relationship when we don't see eye to eye. Because most of the time, the conflict, we have a caricature in our head of what conflict is. So what I want to start with is what I call just two fundamental assertions. The first one is this, is that dialogue is more important than destination. Most of our conversations with each other, and even in conflict, end up becoming alternating monologues rather than a true interchange of two people where dialogue actually occurs. And all you have to do is just listen and watch. Because in a lot of cases, somebody will talk, another person will find something that they can relate to, they'll talk, the other person will go back, and we go from monologue to monologue rather than dialogue, where I would suggest to you two hearts can meet in terms of being heard. Some of it depends on the willingness of the two parties to actually listen for the heart, rather than listening for the facts only. Because our feelings, the feelings that we portray, or even the feelings that are kind of implied, if we listen to them, that stream will take us back to the well of the person's heart. Because in a lot of cases, it displays it. So dialogue is more important than destination. In most of the conversations we have a point we want to make, and we judge the success or failure of that conversation by whether or not we got the point made or whether we arrived at the destination we believe we should. We've really lost the idea of being known as part of conflict. We've completely lost that notion in most of our understandings of it. The second thing that I want to say is that conflict is the gateway to intimacy. You will hear me say this a lot. Some of you guys have been around for a while have heard me say this a lot. And this seems like a complete contradiction in terms. And again, a lot of that has to do with how we see conflict and how we understand conflict. We see conflict as something that's divisive, that will blow up the relationship. We will be abandoned. The other person will move away from us because we won't be able to see eye to eye. There is your destination. In other words, we have to see similarly in order to have any kind of dialogue. And conflict can't possibly be constructive. Some of that has, again, that has a lot to do with how we frame this thing. Because in many circles, and I've heard people describe this, is the moment that another person disagrees or sees things differently, the two people shut down altogether and say, I don't want to have any conflict. I don't want this disagreement. But you got to ask the question, why? because we see disagreement as a enemy to being known, when in fact, the reality is it's only when we're different that we're known, not when we're the same. If I'm fused with another person and think exactly the same thoughts they do and have all the feelings that they do, how can I possibly know anything different about them? I can't. So conflict, if we reframe it, actually gives us an opportunity to experience intimacy in ways we never thought of. So here's an interesting quote. The mark of community, true biblical relationships, is not the absence of conflict. Rather, it's the presence of a reconciling spirit. Some of us assume that there is something inherently wrong or amiss in a relationship that has disagreements or conflicts, but that really isn't the case. All relationships will have conflict. Ultimately, and it is not the presence of the differences or the presence of conflict that's problematic. It is the lack of a reconciling spirit that's fatal to Christian community and relationships. It isn't our differences that ultimately undermine it. It is our unwillingness to deal with those differences in a biblical manner. It is what we do with those differences that is critical. We see differences as the problem. And then we wonder why our relationships never get very far. Because we're trying to emphasize and accentuate the similarity because we think in similarity we can be known. And that really isn't true. A lot of what draws us to people is how they are different from us, not in terms of how they are the same as us. Now, that does not mean, as you no doubt have heard, is that opposites attract. Well, that's just opposites fight. It's not really attract. Differences might. And that's part of the conversation I think we have to have. So I think however it is that you define conflict generally is as a caricature. A caricature is to represent or imitate in some kind of exaggerated and distorted way. That's exactly how we tend to look at conflict. And in comics and other places, this is what some caricatures look like. It's usually an accentuation of some characteristics to make it funny. But conflict is far from funny. It's the one of the things that we fear the most. And to a person, if I were to stand out here at this front door and do a poll of people walking out of Loprino and ask, do you like conflict? I would probably be pretty darn close to 99% of the people would say no, and some might actually add, I flee from it. So here's a caricature. This is a humorous one, but the thing about it that I think is important to pay attention to is exactly how we tend to see conflict. Here it is.
Hey, you too, man. There we go. This song sucks. Talk about lame.
Totally. I can change it if you want.
I don't care, it's up to you.
I can live with it if you can.
Suit yourself. I love you. Oh, God.
Hey, I was just thinking. When we stopped for gas this morning, I think it was you who put the oil in.
Hey, if you're gonna say I didn't put the right kind in, you're wrong. I used 10W30. And besides, motor oil would have nothing to do with this accident.
True, but you can't latch the hood too well if you don't take the can out, you no-selling waste of space. I swear to God, you're worthless.
I'm sorry about your car, but don't call me worthless. I'm trying my best. I'm not my dad.
That's right, you're not your dad. He could sell a ketchup popsicle to a woman in white gloves.
Ketchup popsicle?
Yeah, I learned everything I know from him. I didn't have a father, and he looked out for me, but he was your real dad. You just took it for granted. Hey, I'm big, Justin still fix everything, so I'm allowed to be a moron.
Don't jump! Get out of the car! It's go time! Do it!
Look, Mommy, the rhino's getting too close to the car. That's it, big boy. I'm gonna wail on you.
Hey, boys and girls, off the spur!
You don't want none of me. Think it through.
Come on, give me your best shot. I'll give you a free one. Let me have it. That's it? Come on, you can do better than that, can't you? Captain Limpers, try again. Hey, everybody, is there a window open? I feel a draft. Oh, in a case I would have called your mother. Come on. That was a good one.
Hey, prehistoric forest.
Now listen to the background music.
I'm sorry, so sorry.
Richard, do I have a mark on my face? It really hurts.
Nope, nothing. I thought I hit you on the shoulder.
My shoulder doesn't hurt very much, but my face does. Right here. Not here or here so much, but right here.
Nope. Ship shape.
Yeah, well, how many conflicts tend to go that way? We end up dismembering each other, and then by the time it's all over, we act like nothing has ever happened. That's why we don't engage in conflict very well. Because we carry around a caricature just like this in our brain. We might actually have the actual players in our mind from family and other people that we've seen fight, or worse yet, do the silent treatment, which is almost as violent. It is almost as violent because it punishes somebody with our absence, which says our presence matters. So, the question that we have to ask is, how do you quote unquote fight? Now remember, this is not in our conversation or in our lexicon even. We tend to, when I have a disagreement with someone, we actually say that, right? We just had a fight. It's like, no, that was a fight. This is not a fight. Somebody being sideways with me because we don't see the world the same way is not a fight. But if we characterize it that way, how are we going to react to it? Just the way we characterize it. So we have to ask this question, what is your ultimate goal? When you have a conflict, when you're willing to come out and show that you have a difference of opinion with somebody else, what is your goal and what is it that you want? Because most people, when you look at how they approach this thing, there are one of two things they tend to emphasize. What I want and the outcome of it, or trying to keep the relationship intact somehow. That's usually the two major outcomes. And what we find is that their actual behavior betrays that. So if you were to put it into some kind of table, it will look a little bit like this. The bottom one will talk about relationship first. What kind of behaviors come out of it when somebody says, keeping this relationship intact or making sure that the person doesn't leave, what kind of behaviors tend to show up as their conflict resolution behaviors? Well, the first one is that they yield. And they don't just yield occasionally, they yield all the time. This might be called acquiescence. The funny thing about yielding is it is as an equally controlling way to do it as winning and losing is. Because I can get my desired outcome, except that it's defined in terms of the person not leaving me. So I stand down. I say, no, it's no big deal. Don't worry about it. It's fine. But the thing about yielding is it seeds, little seeds of resentment all along the way, because we sow the ground in our relationship with that other person saying, if I do this, then you won't leave. If I do this, sooner or later, you will yield too. Or if I do this, whatever. And notice the wording, because the wording is contractual. So the yielding person does something that's passive. They stand down, they pull out, but there's always this implicit, yeah, but you should too. So yielding is one. It at least creates the appearance that the relationship is intact, okay? The second one is that the person just simply withdraws. And in most cases, that's what I commented on before, is this silent treatment. And sometimes people will physically withdraw, so they'll run out of the interaction in some way or another, emotionally or otherwise. And it's equally as controlling, because we just are cutting off any further conversation. That's what withdrawal does. Another way to label it is terminal control. Terminal control is I exercise control over something by ending it. It's how we refer to suicide. Suicide is terminal control. I feel so out of control in my life that the only way I can gain any kind of control at all is ending it. The same way with conversations or conflict or whatever, either the person emotionally withdraws and kind of closes themselves into their little castle, or they literally leave and the door slams behind them, end of conversation. Now, the other thing about withdrawing is it limits the amount of loss the person has in the conversation too. See, if we can't continue to converse about this thing, we can't continue to work this thing out, then we can't really make any more mistakes, right? I mean, we can't do that. And so withdrawal oftentimes is one of those strategies that actually limits how much can actually go wrong, which is what the prediction is by the person who's engaging it. So, yeah.
Is the difference between, like, if you're in an argument and you need, like, a minute or two to collect yourself, is the difference between, like, withdrawing and that being, like, communicating and being like, hey, I need some time?
Yeah.
Is that still withdrawing, or is that?
No, that wouldn't be withdrawing, because the ultimate goal is still reconnection, the way you're describing it. Now, if the person says, hey, I just need some time, and never brings it up again, yeah, it is. It's just using those words to cover for it. But, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a minute here, but the problem with these is not that they exist. I think in a lot of relationships, there is a time to withdraw. You know, when we're going hammers and tongs at each other, it's not a good idea to keep going. It's dumb. So withdraw. Somebody have enough sense to do that. But if you do it all the time, then it's a problem. And that's what each of these strategies are about. So relationship, this is the key. This is kind of the center of the target that we're shooting for. The other one is outcome. Outcome is however I want this to turn out. With your agreement, with you not leaving, with whatever the outcome is defined. And what comes out of this one is that if that is my ultimate goal, the first one is either I win or I lose. And in a lot of cases, when somebody engages in a win or lose kind of scenario, it is for power. When we're talking about control, winning and losing is about power. And if I lose all control, all power. You have ultimate power over me. And if I win, I maintain the power that I need to be able to be in this relationship, however that might look. So winning and losing is a lot of times people will say, oh, it's just, we're just competitive. What the hell ever. That's just bullcrap words for I just want to fight with somebody and you're my easiest target. Because that's really what it amounts to. And more often than not, the win or lose strategy is I make somebody a target for some other anger that I'm not dealing with. And I just turn it, they become the kick the dog syndrome, the next clearest target that I have. So win or lose. The fourth strategy is compromise. And compromise looks like it's a really good strategy. It does. It says, I'll come 50% if you come 50%. Or I'll trade you this if you trade me that. And that should sound and ring pretty much like another contract. Compromising is trying to find some middle ground between our stances or our positions, whatever they may be. That's not entirely bad. The problem is, again, is we're caught in a contract. And contracts limit behavior, covenants don't. And so the idea of a compromise can equally set the stage for a continuing cycle of compromise, because that's the only way a compromise can work. We have to constantly renegotiate it. We constantly have to revisit it, because sooner or later there's another circumstance will come up, and the person they're at odds with one another. Let's compromise again. Fine, let's compromise, but we're on an endless track here of dealing with this idea of compromise, and it's 50-50. It's always 50-50, and it's always a trade. And the minute that happens, we're not talking about a relationship anymore. We're talking about a business contract. So the last one that we want to spend the most time talking about is resolve. And I put it this way because resolution, when it comes to conflict, resolution includes all three of these. Resolution never includes winning and losing, ever. That strategy is the one that I guarantee you will tear apart a relationship for the other person to head the other direction. So resolution, if you take the word and break it apart, you have re-solve or re-solution. And that's really what it means, is resolution is built on dialogue. In a lot of these other three instances or four instances, it's built on alternating monologues. But resolution can only mean the dialogue between two people where one person is committed to understanding and knowing where the other person's coming from. And they have the capacity to communicate it in such a way that the other person says, yes, that's it. Yes, Sophia?
Okay, so are you saying that like these build on each other or they're independent of each other?
The four strategies underneath?
Like in the middle?
Yeah, well, the resolution, this resolve, uses these three: compromise, yield, and withdrawal.
But like in order to get to compromise, you don't have to go through yield? Like they're independent?
No, they're independent of each other. Now, the reality is no one person uses only one of these. We'll use a lot of these as part of our strategies. Usually, we will only use what we know or what we've seen. We won't use something new. And most of the time, people don't resolve things because there's too much ambiguity in resolution. If I win or lose, I know whether I win or lose. If I compromise, I know the terms of the agreement. I always know where I stand with that. If I withdraw, that's the same way. But resolution, in order to successfully resolve a conflict, there is some point in it where we're not real sure if we're really going to get to the end. But we're willing to hang in there long enough to continue to have the dialogue, to listen and to see where each other and where there are places where we can actually not necessarily agree, but we can say we understand where the person is coming from. And in a lot of cases, resolution takes longer than these. We resort to these because they result in a quick solution, not a resolution. And that's why resolution is so important. That's why I make my fundamental assertions at the very beginning, is that conflict is a gateway to intimacy, and dialogue is the basis for everything, not being able to achieve whatever the outcome is that you want to see. many years ago, we had, Linda and I had a young couple in our small group, and we ended up kind of, I wouldn't call it discipling them, but mentoring them. And they had a terrible habit of the win or lose thing. And it was World War III when things went off. I mean, character assassinations, name calling, storming out, acting out toward each other, all manner of things. And one of the first things we had to start with them is finding a way to create some kind of moratorium around that kind of behavior. And what I mean by that is cease and desist. Let's try some different skills. And that was not easy to do, because all that mattered in terms of the win and lose, all that mattered is whoever had the biggest gun. It's all that mattered. So whoever got the biggest name calling thing out, or whoever found the most tenderest spot to hit on the other person, and then they collapse, then we go back to licking our wounds, separate corners, and then we wake up in the morning just like those two guys at the table and saying, it's all good, right? Everything's fine. And there'd be another forest fire waiting for them down the way, because inevitably the conflict will come out. So when we were talking about control, you can lay this one right on top of the control thing. Because what drives a lot of these behaviors is to extract something from somebody else. And the conflict is oftentimes the way that we go about doing that. So if we're talking about the building of this pyramid that we've been talking about, one of the reasons that I talk to you guys about forgiveness and repentance and reconciliation before we ever start talking about this stuff is that if I don't have the capacity to learn about forgiveness and repentance, I'm probably not going to do this very well. If we started with this one, you probably would say, yeah, I get it, blah, 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 blah. But the discussion around forgiveness and repentance and reconciliation lays a foundation for a different engagement when we're talking about resolution and talking about what does resolution look like. It looks like reconciliation. It looks like reconciliation. And it includes a sense of, I may not always be right. Now that sounds really simple, but when you're locked in a battle with another person, wanting to make sure that you don't look bad, it's not that simple at all. So, Max Lucado made this comment, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. And that's part of what we have to begin to move toward. But the only way that we can be known, is my assertion is by allowing conflict to exist, allowing differences to exist. And I don't say that in an intellectual, abstract kind of way. I mean that in the way that I'm saying it, is not saying, yeah, I enjoy the differences we share. The reality is the longer you get in a relationship, the more irritating those differences are. They are. And anybody that tells you otherwise is lying to you. And the farther you go, the more oftentimes they get accentuated. The couples that demonize the differences between them are the ones that end up using and ending up in combat. The ones that begin to understand what drives the differences and what makes for the kind of landscape of somebody's heart that produces that difference, suddenly they see the difference very differently. Whatever. They see it very differently because they see it as part of the tapestry, the rich tapestry of knowing another person. They don't see it as a threat anymore. And that's hard to get to. That is not easy to get to. And a lot of times it takes a few tries of accomplishing that end, but it can be done. So with that then, if conflict is the gateway to intimacy, then if I refresh your memory here a little bit, this is where we've come from, where we have the pyramid that we've been building, and we started with truth and reality. Remember that these things do build on one another. Because if we're going to engage in way up the pyramid to conflict, then I better set the foundation on dealing with the person as they really are, not as I want them to be, and praying with some grace that they will do the same for me in truth. And I reveal that truth in vulnerability to the other person. And it's the basis on which all relationships build. When we're talking about pure glass people, we're talking about people that are striving to make themselves accessible to other people. And that's why this is always the starting point. Where we go from that is, I'm not going to use information and truth on somebody to control their behavior. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to accentuate their freedom and give them the choices that are theirs. And boundaries, inevitably, you can't have the kind of relationships we're talking about, and pure glass people know where their limits are. They understand where they end and somebody else begins. And then, of course, forgiveness and reconciliation, and then conflict. Well, where do we land? We land at the very last place. And the thing about the pyramid that I showed you that I liked, and that why I was drawn to the South American pyramids, is all of the pyramids always had a temple at the top. And one of the things that I found fascinating is when Paul said, "Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit?" Does that not suggest the level of intimacy we have with God? A temple is a symbol of the intimacy that we're inviting other people into. We invite people into our heart. That's what vulnerability allows that to happen. So intimacy is the natural next step. So, quoting the great philosopher Buzz Lightyear,
To infinity and beyond.
I just will change it to intimacy and beyond. The challenge is all the things that interfere. I got Noah back. Buzz Lightyear does it every time. He was fading really fast back there. But this stuff is always cycling. We always have to understand that intimacy has no end. Why? Because it always needs calibration. It always. Every person we come into contact with, when we begin to strike up friendship and relationship, it needs recalibration. And so the one thing I want to make really, really clear to you is intimacy is not a always ascending trend in our relationships all the time. It is rather significant moments in our lives where we are known and known by another person. The other question I would ask you is, which space do you live in? The space between your ears or the space between you and another person? I could have brought in another clip, but I wouldn't. It was from Star Trek, and that would have gone poorly. So, but something that I've thought about often, in terms of all the time that I've spent talking to people, is 9 times out of 10, when things go out of phase in their relationships with the other person, is because they're interacting with the person in their head, not in real time. In other words, they're not interacting with the person in the space between the two people, in the space between us. And it is the most dangerous space ever. That's why we choose the space in our head. And that's why our intimacy suffers, because we are all risk averse when it comes to entering into that place. In offering up, and we've been talking about all semester about vulnerability and authenticity and all of those kind of concepts. Well, guess what? Those are space between us values. Those are not space in your head values. You can't have authenticity if you're going to interact with somebody in your head. You can't. because authenticity is in that space between us that is really important as far as intimacy goes. So, what is it? I'm going to throw a few definitions at you. One's a very common one. A good friend of mine said, "What is intimacy?" He said, "Into me see." Which fits right with our metaphor about pure glass people. Into me see. The intentionality that I bring to it, Merriam-Webster says, making something of a personal or private nature known especially publicly or formally. That was the challenge, wasn't it, with the groups, right? Making something of a private nature known publicly. And most of the time, the people around you in your group were not the threat. It was you. It was a conclusion you made about what you had to say, not what conclusions they made. So, the challenge of being known, we can talk a really good game about intimacy, but then we never take the risk of vulnerability or authenticity either, which means that it's little more than an abstract concept. So, driving down to the most basic thing is, what is it? It is being known and knowing others. Remember, we talked about pure glass people know enough to have blinds on their glass, that they can pull the blinds with people that are outside that have no business knowing what's going on inside. And that's part of the key of being those kinds of people. It's not being mean. Not everyone is entitled to seeing in. Not everyone is. So, there are a number of things, there are questions I want to pose to you. First of all, how well do you know yourself? Because a lot of people might say, well, I really don't know him or her that well. And usually my response is, I wonder how well they know themselves. Because if I haven't done the work necessary to know myself, then exactly what do I have to share with anyone else if I have not done that work? And if generally what I see or what pieces of the glass that I see that I have condemned, then I sure as hell am not going to offer that up to somebody else. So when we go back and talk about the boundaries stuff that we talked about, and I said to you, you can't give away what you don't own, that's the same thing here. You cannot share with somebody something you don't know, let alone the most basic part of that, and that is you won't accept. So the reiteration of that comes in is I can't give away something I don't own. If I don't own my heart, if I don't know what's in the well of my soul, then how in the world am I going to give that away to somebody? I can give away as much as I know, but there's always limits. Because the funny thing about that well of ours is that thing's always changing too. So it takes a regular inventory, if you will, to be able to be able to offer it up. So if I don't own my heart, then I'm going to have a pretty tough time giving it to anybody else. And those four things are fundamental to what we're talking about with intimacy. We turn the pyramid upside down. We would much rather go to intimacy first rather than all the other hard work that goes into the kinds of conversations that we're talking about and we can look at when we're talking about intimacy. But in the final analysis, intimacy is all around our heart. It's always about that. And it will never cease to be. So we have to ask the questions, and now we've got a little bit of idea what it is. Why is it so important? Well, first and foremost, it's important for growth. In psychology, many of you guys are psych majors, you know this, is that when a kid is given all that they need and to eat and all they need to drink, but never emotionally touched in any way, shape, or form, that kid will die. It's called failure to thrive. They need intimacy to grow. We saw that in the orphanages in Romania after the wall fell. And caregivers were 1 to 50 kids, and a lot of those kids died because they didn't get held. They got food and water, but that was all they got. And the funny thing about it is, even within our ranks today, we may be getting all the food and water we need. We may be getting all of our basic needs met, but because of a lot of the barriers we create, we're failing to thrive when it comes to intimacy. Yeah, Paige.
Just out of curiosity, do you think that's the same as far as like old people in like old folks' homes when they're just
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The ones that don't get visited, they fall into the same kind of process. It looks very similar. Actually, if you did, and it's funny you'd mention that, because my mom was in one of those nursing homes for a period of time, and I was kind of horrified at what I saw when I walked down the halls. And so I went on a little quest to find that out and ask that very question. And the interesting thing is the syndromes are very, very similar between kids and geriatric patients that are not, they're cared for. They are cared for, but there's nobody that knows them that comes to see them. And it really precipitates, I think, a quicker death oftentimes. You'll see a lot of psychiatric symptoms that go along with it, with the withdrawal into what would look like catatonia because of the very same thing. So yeah, perfect catch on that one. So why is it so important? It's necessary for our growth. It's necessary for us to be seen and known in order to grow. The second thing is it is essential for love. I had to quote Olaf here real quickly. And the basis on all love is being known. Why did God create humans? Why did he create humans? Why bother? There had been a headache for millions of, thousands of generations, right? To be known. It's in our spiritual DNA to be known. That's the image of God in us to be known. So it is the basis of all love. I would go even farther and add to it the dimension in terms of what we've been talking about in class, and that is, it is the basis of grace. If we take the risk of being known and we're loved as we are, that's grace. That is grace. So, a couple quotes I'm going to throw at you before I draw this to a conclusion. The first one is this one. Some people are convinced that they are emotionally safe when they remain guarded, unexposed, and thick-skinned. They are cautious not to truly reveal themselves for fear. In being seen for who they are, they will be exposed and ultimately left defenseless. Protected and unassailable, their relationships never go beyond a superficial level. At the same time, they lament the absence of the deep intimacy necessary for love. And I'd stop for just a second and say, sometimes that sounds like churches to me. When we defend, protect, and guard, we isolate ourselves into loneliness. We may escape severe emotional trauma, but in so doing, we miss the ultimate joys of true intimacy. Only by allowing ourselves to be vulnerable do we stand a chance at succeeding in love. If, in the end, we are deceived, betrayed, or tricked, we can at least say we tried. And in a sense, we have succeeded if we do not allow the scars of experience to cause us to develop a thick and impenetrable skin. When we gain the insight to realize that vulnerability is the soul of love, we will surely heal and try again. Leo Buscaglia. Leo was a very popular writer back in the 80s. And it's a profound comment that he makes in this regard. And it will be echoed by another person that you no doubt will recognize. But this idea that vulnerability is the soul of love. If we trace what we do with vulnerability, we can probably trace what level or measure or how we're loved. So, it's important for growth, it's important for love, and it's important and essential for community. Community, again, I'm breaking words apart today, but unity, to be with another in unity, not uniformity, not everybody looking the same, not unanimity, everybody saying the same things, but being with another in our diversity. Because unity has diversity in it. That's not a new concept at all. And how can I say that? Look at the Trinity. There's a diversity in the Trinity and yet a unity there as well. And that's built into our spiritual DNA. Again, is the idea of being known in that way. So the thing I want to just throw out here is what I call circles of community, because ultimately we have to be realistic about the people in our lives and how they fit, because not everyone is going to be an intimate. Not everyone is. The reality is we live in embedded communities. In a lot of cases, CCU probably fits somewhere over here. Over here. We have our intimates. We have those people who know and understand and have personal information about us and are people that we've opened the blind to, and they really know us as much or to whatever degree we know ourselves. Our best friends are just a grade out, if you will. They may not have all the personal information that intimates, but they're pretty darn close, and we see them, we have a conversation with them, we know their background, we know a little bit of their history, we may not know the ins and outs of it all, and then we have acquaintances and people that we see on the path or whatever, wave, kind of recognize their face, maybe know their name, and that's about the extent of it, and then we got everybody else. The thing is that in a lot of cases when we come into contact with people, they might start as an acquaintance, but then they start zooming in closer and closer. And then at some point we realize that there's some differences that occur there. And then we've got some choices to make, because we've got, what are we going to do with that person, if you will? Not to throw them out, but we may have to develop the boundaries differently for each person that is part of our circle of community. But we live in all three of these communities all the time. We phase in and out of them on a regular basis. And it's worth paying attention to that it is important, intimacy is important in all of these. Now, it's a different level of intimacy I'm talking about, but it's equally as important in terms of community. Again, why is the favorite griping subject of all time here at CCU the community? Because we have the wrong expectations. That's why. We can't expect from people out here this kind of expectation. We can't. It's impossible. So maybe if we adjust our expectations, adjust it to what it is, and maybe we can start making some changes in how we relate to these people. Guess what? It could infuse out there. It could infuse out there. So, let me end with this. To love it all is to be vulnerable. You probably have heard this quote. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Sounds familiar, huh? Great minds. Now, I will end on this. The question I have for you guys, you don't have to answer it, but what kind of relationship do you want? Do you want a you should relationship? Somebody, or you're the person that tells people what they should do and how they should think and how they should behave and what kind of choices they should make? Or a Me Too relationship? I was struck again, even this Easter, of the remarkable nature of the God that we serve that chose to be a Me Too God, taking on human form, experiencing all the temptations that you and I experience, and says, yeah, me too, I get it. I get it. It's not a high priest that is described in Hebrews that is separate from us. It's a high priest that says, me too. We don't think of them going together like that. The second question is this: not what kind of community are you a part of, but what kind of community do you create? A you should or a me too? Me too can't be found in just saying me too. Words won't do it. It's digging deep enough to find the commonalities that we all share with one another, and allowing another to tell their story unabated, unedited, and really uninterfered with. That's every bit as a Me Too moment as anything is. And that's the punchline here, is why grace? Because we all want a different kind of community. We all want a different kind of relationship. If we want shame, don't change. But if we grab onto grace, we can't help but change. And there's the punchline. So, we have come to the end. How aptly landed. Any questions? Okay, I'll see you Wednesday. We'll debrief then.